Welcome to the Empty World podcast, a space where we normalize conversations on post-growth, planetary boundaries, and the well-being economy with thought leaders from across the globe. I'm your host, Gabriel Bonomi. I'm a master's student at MIT, and today we're exploring the intersection of degrowth, community renewable energy, and energy justice. I'm joined today by Professor Vasilis Kostakis, who is a professor of technology governance and sustainability at Taltech in Estonia, and a faculty associate at Harvard University's Berkman Klein Center. He's also the founder of the P2P Lab and a founding member of both the Tsoumakas Rural Makerspace and the Common N Energy Cooperative in his hometown of Ioannina, Greece. His work on commons-based peer production, energy democracy, and alternatives to growth-based economic models has been published in 16 languages and has helped shape emerging conversations about sustainable and equitable transitions. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Vasilis, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
Starting with your work, Vasilis, you've explored commons-based approaches to energy systems. Could you explain what a commons-based energy system looks like in practice and how it differs from both market-based and state-controlled models?
A commons-based energy system, I would say, fundamentally changes who controls energy resources and how decisions are made. So such a system looks like a network of community-owned initiatives where people collectively manage their energy resources. For example, we have studied energy cooperatives where members collectively, democratically produce energy through projects ranging from rooftop solar to small wind turbines and biomass facilities. So these cooperatives are democratically governed by their members. Unlike market-based models that prioritize profit maximization, commons-based systems focus on community needs, sustainability, and equitable access. And unlike state-controlled models with centralized decision-making, commons-based systems distribute power to those who are being affected.
A follow-up question I have is, you've written about how energy is often viewed as a commodity rather than a fundamental factor of production. How would reframing energy as a commons change our approach to energy policy? And perhaps you could detail this at various scales.
Very good question. I think that reframing energy as a commons, as a shared resource, as a shared good, I would say, would transform energy policy in several important ways. To begin with, it would shift the core objective from profit maximization to meeting community needs. Current policies primarily serve market interests, but a commons-based approach would prioritize universal access and sustainability. So energy would be a commons versus energy as a commodity. Second, it would democratize decision-making. Major energy decisions would involve those directly affected rather than being made by distant corporations or other agencies, state agencies, whatever. Third, I think that it would change technology development. It's a very important pillar, emphasizing open source solutions where knowledge is freely shared rather than proprietary technologies protected by strict patents. Another way such an approach would transform infrastructure investment towards distributed community-scale projects that are responsive to local needs rather than, these centralized mega projects. And finally, perhaps it would reconceptualize energy security through community resilience and diverse local resources. This is, Gabriel, this is not theoretical. Right now, energy communities worldwide are already demonstrating these principles in practice, showing how reframing energy as a commons leads to more democratic and sustainable ecosystems.
I was about to say, when it comes to balancing the theoretical insights with empirical observations, on the ground, in the field, how does your work on commons-based peer production offer an alternative framework for thinking about energy transitions?
As you very well know, the energy crisis is fundamentally rooted in economic and political structures. It's not just technology. Technology is not neutral. Commons-based production offers an alternative framework by transforming relationships and power dynamics. For example, this approach turns passive consumers into active, as we say, prosumers, who both produce and use energy. In our research on energy communities, we have seen how this direct participation creates deeper engagement with energy systems and democracy. It facilitates knowledge sharing across contexts through open source designs that communities can adapt to their specific needs while contributing improvements back to the global digital commons. I referred before to power relations. So traditional energy systems often concentrate power in corporations and states, but commons-based approaches would distribute agency to communities. For example, our study of the Wind Empowerment Association, this is a global association that produces small-scale open-source renewables. Our research shows how communities can develop technological autonomy, how they can become technologically sovereign, if you will, while remaining connected to global knowledge networks. And I think perhaps most significantly, commons-based approaches embed different values in the technologies themselves. They prioritize sustainability, repairability, and community empowerment rather than profit maximization. So this framework, the commons-based framework, reveals that energy transitions aren't just about replacing fossil fuels with renewables within existing structures, but they are about transforming how energy is produced, who controls it, and what values guide its development.
You mentioned community values, democratizing access, and control over energy production at the local scale. Here at MIT's Department of Urban Studies and Planning, we have a lot of people working on consensus building. What kind of roadblocks do local communities run into when they think about implementing a commons-based approach to energy? And how do you manage divisions within communities?
As in mainstream, let's say, energy production and in mainstream businesses, in business as usual, there are many different business models and many different contexts, many different approaches, and thus many different obstacles that any business, no matter whether it is a commons-oriented or a profit maximization, would face. So I cannot provide a single answer to a very complicated question because these discussions should take place on a case-by-case basis. In Greece, for instance, we used to have a very friendly institutional framework for energy communities, energy cooperatives, but during the past 5 years, the situation has dramatically changed. So institutionally, here the conditions are not favorable for energy communities, for commons-based energy systems. In France or in the US or even in California, you can find different institutional frameworks from state to the state. So the major obstacle is the unfriendly institutional settings because, for example, let's say that you're a prime minister or you're the president of the United States, okay? One of the main goals of yours is to maximize GDP, gross domestic product, okay? If you self-produce your energy, because when you have a self-producing energy community, energy cooperative, then you would not maximize GDP. So the current institutional framework would qualify for profit maximization energy businesses over energy businesses like the energy cooperatives that produce energy to address local needs without selling the energy for a price at the market, without maximizing profits.
So you've mentioned that 5 years ago in Greece, the institutional environment was more favorable. Could you pick out maybe one or two elements of that framework that allowed for a tolerance or at least a security for these models to develop?
The energy network is scarce. The capacity, of the energy network is limited. Okay, so the previous legal framework would allow energy cooperatives that were created by local municipalities, for example, to find place into the limited energy network, because these energy cooperatives were created with the aim to address local needs, not to maximize profits, but to address the needs of public hospitals, public schools, whatever. So this was the case, but it is not right now. So right now, the current government, for example, would create more favorable conditions for the big corporations to enter the limited energy network, would favor mega projects, would understand energy as a commodity.
Coming back to the rollout of local renewable energy technologies, your research discusses the rebound effect. Other people might know it as the Jevons paradox. We explored this notion in the previous episode of The Empty World, the idea that efficiency gains often lead to increased resource consumption. I'm wondering how the spread of community-controlled renewable energy systems can address or avoid this paradox in ways that market solutions cannot.
When people directly manage their energy resources, then they develop a more conscious relationship with energy. They understand where it comes from, its limitations, often leading to more thoughtful consumption patterns. Unlike markets that are driven to expand consumption when efficiency improves, community systems can prioritize sufficiency, establishing shared norms around appropriate energy use and even collectively deciding that enough is enough. So the democratic governance in commons-based systems allows communities, those who participate, to explicitly decide how to use efficiency gains. So rather than automatically channeling these efficiency gains into more consumption, energy cooperatives, for example, might reduce production, invest in ecosystem restoration, or meet other community needs. Markets reward increased production. Commons-based systems, like energy cooperatives, can develop alternative success metrics based on well-being, for example, and sustainability. And finally, these systems typically operate at scales where environmental impacts are visible to the decision makers, therefore creating tighter feedback loops between resource use and ecological consequences. So together, all these characteristics, I think, enable community-controlled energy systems to break Jevons paradox by embedding energy use within social relationships and ecological awareness rather than a market expansion logic.
That's fascinating. The idea that people can experience greater environmental consciousness through a direct experience with energy production is very heartening to hear. Relatedly, is there anything that might unite communities that have had this experience? What are characteristics that describe communities that have undergone that shift in consciousness?
When people directly participate in energy production, we have seen that they develop a kind of infrastructural awareness that was previously hidden. For example, participants who built wind turbines began noticing wind patterns in daily life and discussing weather in relation to energy potential, for example. So energy became visible to them in new ways. We have also seen growing awareness of limits and sufficiency. When community members, for example, experience what it takes to produce electricity, they often question wasteful consumption. As one participant in a wind turbine, if I'm not mistaken, a manufacturing workshop told us, I never turned off lights before, but now I know exactly what it takes to generate power. So this consciousness extends beyond electricity to other resource systems. Cooperative members, for example, often become, at least in our energy community, in our energy cooperative, they become more engaged with food systems, water conservation, and even waste reduction. Of course, this shift is never automatic. It requires facilitated reflection, community dialogue to translate, all this experience into deeper awareness. And this is something that we have been doing here in our city, as you said, with our local energy cooperative. And because we are aware of the local culture, this is a place where we can pursue this line of research. And I think this shift extends from in this individual awareness to collective responsibility, because participants, and this is something that we see very often in studying commons, not only energy commons but many types of commons, participants develop a sense of shared stewardship, not just for their energy systems but for broader ecological systems they depend on.
You mentioned a facilitated dialogue to translate people's direct experience of a commons-based energy system into maybe wider insights, and I really appreciated the way you described the kind of domino effect that occurs when people gain greater consciousness around what energy use actually looks like, and then that extends over to the food systems, perhaps to water use and waste management. Could you explore what those facilitated conversations and dialogues look like?
That's very hard for me to tell, because first, we haven't done any systematic research around that. And second, it's hard to communicate because much of these processes involve a lot of unconscious work, effort. One has to be aware of the local context. And that's why I believe that there is no silver bullet when we discuss and when we approach. I mean, I don't believe in best practices. There are some good practices, but there is no best practice. There are some good practices, and a certain practice can be good for a certain region, but not good at all, very inappropriate for another region. And that's why I think that the most effective governance models that I have observed use what I could call as modular governance with nested autonomy. There are different coordinated layers that are very cultural and context specific. So my answer is a typical answer that someone working in academia would give you. Like, I don't know. It's hard to tell.
It depends.
It depends, yes.
Could you help us understand the very complex series of words you just shared with us?
Yeah. The modular governance with nested autonomy. Yes. So this approach works through coordinated layers. For example, small neighborhood energy clusters, let's say of 10 to 15, households, may maintain substantial autonomy over day-to-day decisions while sending representatives to community-wide assemblies for broader coordination, let's say. For regional matters, communities may participate in federation structure. So what makes this effective is matching decision authority to the scale of the issue. I mean, we have local choices remain local, while coordination functions happen at higher levels. For example, in our region here, we have our small-scale energy cooperative, energy community. It includes 60 household and small enterprises. We have our general assemblies twice per year, but also there is Greece is a small country, so there is also a national institution to which our energy community belongs. And this national institution, this kind of network, decides upon issues that have wider policy implications nationwide. Also in the EU, there is a RESCOOP that includes maybe 1,000 something energy cooperatives. So there are at least 3 different layers that coordinate with each other, from the regional to the national to the international level.
I see. You've also written about the limitations of commons-based energy models. I remember you mentioning high initial costs and potential inefficiencies of small-scale production. I might also add uncertainty around the possibility for commons-based energy models to account for 100% of a community's energy needs. How might these challenges be addressed, especially when scaling beyond pilot projects?
Addressing this limitation, I think, requires different creative approaches across financial, technical, and social dimensions, if not more. For example, for high initial costs, pooled financing mechanisms may allow multiple communities to share capital resources. An energy cooperative can have many projects, okay? So one project's returns can finance the next community's infrastructure, for example. There are also hybrid ownership structures combining community ownership with municipal support or social enterprise investment to distribute costs effectively. There are many different ways. Moreover, knowledge sharing platforms, for example, reduce inefficiencies by allowing communities to learn from each other's experiences, avoiding mistakes. So in the European case, we discussed before, in our region, we have one energy community, but we have many other energy communities in the Greek territory who talk to each other. They develop common infrastructure, but they are also members of the European network. This is how they support each other. So the path to scaling, I would say, isn't necessarily replicating identical projects, but rather creating networked ecosystems where diverse community initiatives support each other while maintaining local adaptation. So you are global, but you are also very local. You are globally connected, but you are locally oriented. I would invite us to revisit the scaling concept. In capitalism, we talk about scaling up, but in this case, we would call it like scaling wide. You have small scale, locally oriented, but globally connected energy cooperatives, if we talk about energy systems.
I really like the idea of scaling wide. And your answer provides the perfect segue to my next question, which is on the concept of design global, manufacture local. You suggest that while knowledge and design can be global commons, physical production should be localized. How does this principle apply specifically to energy infrastructure?
Yeah, the design global manufacture local logic, or cosmolocalism, as we sometimes say, I think it offers a very interesting framework for energy infrastructure development. In practice, this design global manufacture local means that knowledge, designs, and expertise are shared globally, while physical energy systems, if we talk about energy, are produced and maintained locally. Whatever is light becomes global knowledge, and whatever is heavy is local and ideally shared. Heavy can be an energy infrastructure, machinery, whatever. For example, in our research on small-scale wind turbines, technical specifications circulate through global networks like the Wind Department Association, but manufacturing uses local materials adapted to local conditions. And from a sustainability point of view, this is very important, because this approach offers several advantages for energy infrastructure. We don't have enough time to address all of them, but you get the idea. So this approach, I would say, fundamentally shifts agency to local communities while maintaining connections to broader knowledge commons. Energy infrastructure developed through this cosmolocal, if you will, approach tends to be more culturally appropriate, technically sustainable, because it is being designed to last as long as possible. There's no profit maximization involved, and democratically governed than purely global or purely local solutions. It is a synthesis of localization and globalization polarities, if you want.
Could you describe what manufacturing local looks like? I remember you mentioning local makerspaces in some of your research. Bring us through the process of a community making these choices for itself and embracing those concepts.
There are many examples from the global south and the global north. Let's just give one example from the global south. So we are in southwest Nepal, in Mitial. It is an isolated community on the mountains. And this community needed to electrify the local health clinic. So people from this local community, they were connected with people from a local university in Nepal. And these people from the local university in Nepal, they were members of the Global Wind Empowerment Association. This association that democratizes knowledge and manufacturing processes around renewables. Okay, so people from the Wind Empowerment Association joined forces with their local fellows in Nepal. They ran a manufacturing workshop in a makerspace. A makerspace is like, a kind of small-scale factory, let's say, equipped with CNC machines, perhaps 3D printers, but also traditional crafts. And they locally manufactured 2 small-scale wind turbines and 1 small-scale solar panel, because the Mitial village was off-grid. So manufacturing took place locally in a workshop. I don't remember how many days, I think around 10 days, something like that. Local people were involved in manufacturing, so they developed an expertise and knowledge to maintain the wind turbines afterwards. And these 2 wind turbines, along with the solar panel facility, they were installed in the Mitial village. So this is a very typical case of a small-scale wind turbine workshop based on the global digital commons around open source renewables.
I really appreciate you anchoring these concepts into a community. I think it really helps to identify what these models actually look like on the ground. In the interest of time and as a stark transition to the global scale, I've found that, and much of the literature on commons-based approaches and degrowth comes from European contexts. Based on your work with institutions in both Europe and the US, like Harvard, what cultural, political, or institutional factors make it challenging to translate degrowth principles to American contexts?
That's a very long discussion. I would try to be as concise as possible, although this is an impossible task. So the American cultural emphasis on individual freedom rather than community collective well-being creates a significant barrier. Degrowth means GDP contraction. To get rid of this fetishism with increasing gross domestic product. Okay, so degrowth principles emphasize community-scale solutions and collective restraint, which can appear as restrictions on personal liberty. European participants often in our research often framed energy community participation as contributing to the common good, while American participants emphasized energy independence. At the same time, political polarization in the US complicates matters. As you know, environmental issues have become highly partisan, making it difficult to build broad coalitions around resource limits. While in Europe, we have seen more cross-partisan acceptance of ecological limits. As I said before, the American economic identity is deeply tied to growth as a core national narrative. The American dream, for example, connects social mobility with material expansion in ways that make degrowth principles appear threatening to the US cultural values. Also, institutionally, stronger European welfare systems, provide safety nets that make degrowth transitions less threatening in the EU. Without robust social supports, economic degrowth in the US, GDP degrowth in the US, raises, I believe, justified fears about increased hardship. Moreover, the scale and car dependency of American infrastructure, it presents, practical challenges. But despite all these challenges, I believe there are promising entry points through concepts like community resilience, local self-reliance, self-sufficiency that incorporate elements of degrowth thinking without explicitly challenging growth. The Energy Commons framework, for example, emphasizes local control and community benefit, and that's why I believe can resonate well with the US people, even when the explicit degrowth framing might be rejected.
I completely agree. There is something very liberating about self-sufficiency that characterizes a socially acceptable form of degrowth without explicitly referring to it as such. There's a think tank in France called the Shift Project that has outlined a comprehensive transformation plan for the French economy that's neither explicitly growth nor degrowth oriented. How do you view such middle path approaches that focus on decarbonization without explicitly challenging growth? And perhaps this can also tie into my question on figuring out how we respond to people who argue that degrowth is politically impossible in the current global system.
First, my knowledge about the SHIFT project is limited, but in general, I believe that middle path approaches like the SHIFT project, they do make pragmatic contributions to the current policy landscape because they provide some concrete roadmaps that can build broader coalitions. However, by not explicitly challenging growth, I believe that such middle path approaches may underestimate the scale of change needed because, as degrowth scholarship very well, I think, very convincingly demonstrates, absolute reductions in energy and material throughput are necessary in high-consuming countries. So these approaches, the middle path approaches in terms of growth or degrowth, growth versus degrowth, they often, I think, maintain existing power structures while just trying to change some technical configurations. So without addressing who controls and benefits from energy systems, if we discuss about energy, technical transitions may reproduce or even exacerbate existing inequalities. We have to become political. Everything is political. I mean, there is no apolitical. If you say that I'm neutral, then it means that you like the current status quo, and with some, hacks, you're trying to fix it. And especially the discussion around the ownership models are very important. I mean, who produces energy, who owns the energy infrastructure. So I see these approaches as complementary, potentially complementary, but because they can create some policy windows and infrastructure change that make deeper transitions more feasible. But I think that at the end of the day, we have to radically challenge growth. I wouldn't choose, between middle paths and fundamental transformations. I would consider how they can work together, building alternatives while reforming existing systems to create space for deeper, more radical changes.
Oftentimes, the argument behind the necessity of degrowth is that the amount of energy and resources that we have at our disposal is finite. And given the linear relationship between the resources that we have and the productive capacity of the global economy, at one point GDP will decline naturally. So as we try to manage this peak and decline, how do you feel about communicating the urgency of the moment, and specifically the choice that offers itself to us, accepting sufficiency and managed degrowth versus a business as usual scenario which will be confronted with resource and climate shocks that will undoubtedly increase existing levels of inequality?
I get the question, and it's very complicated. We can, even if we spend weeks discussing this question, I don't think it's like trying to square the circle.
Yeah.
Yes. But in general, I'm quite pessimist in intellect, as Gramsci would say. So I believe that we are going to experience enforced degrowth, but I'm very optimistic in my actions. And that's why we have created energy communities and many other real-life projects, because we believe that through action, we can prefigure the world that we want to build and live and experience, although the situation is very hard. And it's very complicated also. Not only hard, but also complicated for us to understand and manage.
I hear that. Being in 2025 also, this wouldn't be a podcast conversation without mentioning AI. In some of your earlier work, you hinted at scenarios where automation might affect not just workers, but also managerial classes. And I think that was in 2018.
Yeah.
Given where we are today, what's your take on the role of AI developments in facilitating a broader social movement which advocates for degrowth?
I'm not an AI expert, but I have a good understanding of AI. So I see at least two sides. So on the opportunity side, AI could help address coordination challenges, for instance, in distributed energy systems. For example, the complexity of balancing supply and demand across decentralized networks is a key challenge. AI could potentially facilitate this coordination while preserving local autonomy. Moreover, AI might democratize certain forms of expertise that currently constrain community energy development. For example, advanced design optimization that previously required specialized engineering knowledge could become accessible to communities through AI interfaces supporting our design global manufacture local model. We discussed before about open source renewables. With AI, open source renewables could be, the designs of open source renewables could be better tailored to local needs and local biophysical conditions. But the automation of managerial functions raises profound questions about work and distribution. If, for example, productivity gains from AI were shared equitably rather than concentrated, they could theoretically support reduced working hours and material throughput while maintaining well-being, which are key degrowth objectives. But on the other side, the risks are equally, if not more, significant. As you know, AI systems are not apolitical. They embed the values of the creators and owners, and current development trajectories primarily optimize for profit and growth rather than sufficiency or democratic control. So if we don't have deliberate efforts to align AI with commons community principles, then these technologies may reinforce rather than transform existing power structures. Of course, energy. From an energy point of view, AI systems are very energy intensive, and they can also conflict with energy sufficiency goals. The carbon footprint of large AI models is substantial. So for AI to generally support degrowth, post-growth, and commons-based approaches, we need what we might call as convivial AI, that are systems designed to enhance community autonomy rather than replace human judgment or centralized control.
I want to be respectful of your time, and I know we've come to the end of the conversation, but I wanted to ask you one last question as a young researcher. What do you see as the most exciting and promising avenues for further research in degrowth and commons-based approaches to energy systems?
I think that exciting, research directions are emerging at this intersection. These may include exploring governance innovations that balance local autonomy with broader coordination, understanding energy sufficiency practices, exploring data commons for energy systems. As energy digitalization advances, questions of data ownership become increasingly important. So research on community-controlled data infrastructures presents a crucial area for development. In energy communities, for instance, who owns the data? Are data trusts, data cooperatives going to be created? Who builds the smart meters? Are they open source, open hardware, open source software? Yeah, what else? Yes, maybe also examining cultural transformations through commons participation is another topic for research. Supportive institutional designs, how energy communities and energy democracy and open source systems can be supported by regional state government. And last but not least, I think it's very important and I'm particularly excited about participatory action research approaches that co-produce knowledge with communities. So these approaches, the research approaches, not only generate more insights, but also contribute directly to the development of alternatives. So as researchers, I believe our goal is not only to understand reality, but to actively shape and change reality.
Well, it sounds like there's a lot of work to do, and being creative is at the heart of the work that needs to be done. Listen, Vasilis, I want to thank you again for sharing your insights with me about commons-based energy systems and the possibilities for implementing degrowth principles in practice.
It was a pleasure talking with you.
What stands out to me from our discussion is that community renewable energy isn't just about changing technology, it's about reimagining the economic, social and political systems that determine how energy is produced, distributed and consumed. I really appreciated your reminder that there are no best but only good practices, and in doing so you mentioned the importance of scaling wide and going against uniformity while embracing local diversity. Thank you also for sharing examples from your work, demonstrating that alternatives are not only theoretically possible but already emerging. I think it's very exciting. For listeners interested in learning more about these topics, you can find Professor Kostakis' work through the P2P Lab website that'll be in this episode's bio. Is there anything you'd like to add, Vasilis, before I close?
I just wanted to highlight that I believe that energy cooperatives, because much of our discussion was around energy cooperatives, can be laboratories of deepening democracy. And at the current chaotic times, I think that we need more democracy, and democracy is the solution to our problems.
Thank you, Vasilis. I'm Gabriel Bonomi, and we'll be back very soon with more conversations exploring pathways to a more just and sustainable future. Thank you for listening to the Empty World podcast. If this conversation resonated with you, I'd love to hear about it. You can find me online. I hope you enjoyed this episode and that you'll stick around for the next one we have in store for you. The very best.